Good morning, YouTube. I realized in my last video I did on this, thanks to a person who commented, I did in fact say some things backwards and wrong. Oh, that door sounds terrible. So, life is often about admitting your mistakes and when you are wrong and correcting them. So that's what this whole video is about. I'm going to make the first video I did on this somewhat private, but in today's video I will be explaining again how aircraft controls work, but this time correcting what I said wrong the first time. Okay, so without any further ado, let's get into it. This time I'm going to say things in a reverse order. I'm going to talk about the brakes, the magnetos, the starting procedure, and then I'm going to cover the throttle quadrant and what all these do. So, first, we have the brakes. Okay, so this is your steering, left and right. And then your brakes are up here on the toes. So this would be your right wheel brake and your left wheel brake. So you actually turn with your heels and brake with your toes. Okay? Nice and simple. Now moving over here, I'm going to pull this back for a second and show you the series of switches. But under here we have the battery. There's no battery in the aircraft, right? You have your battery power, you have your left alternator, and your right alternator. Of course, these are generators on this airplane, but you get the idea. So I'm gonna go ahead and flip those back off. You have your left magneto and your right magneto for your left engine. You have your left magneto and your right magneto for your right engine. I hope this is coming out okay. Okay. A magneto essentially generates the spark. Okay. Aircraft don't have electronic ignition like cars do. They don't have a distributor like a car does that uses battery power. The magneto generates its own power and creates a spark. So that's that. So what you do is you hit your battery, you'd turn on all your magnetos, you would prime the engine with fuel, and then you would hit the start button. So here's your left engine start button, your right engine start button, and you just hold that like you would a regular starter until the aircraft starts. So now the airplane is running. You would drive it around, taxi it with those foot controls and the brakes that I showed you. But how do you actually control the throttle? How do you actually control the mixture? Well, in that sense, it's a little similar to a boat in the sense that you have your throttle here and you have idle all the way back and you have full power all the way forward. So now this has two engines. You got your left engine and you got your right engine. Okay, so throttle for the left, throttle for the right, propeller for the left, propeller for the right, mixture for the left, mixture for the right. Okay, throttle's pretty straightforward. On an airplane like this with constant speed propellers, throttle is all about a power setting, which for power setting you'd use right here your manifold pressure. Manifold pressure is the amount of pressure that's in the intake manifold in between the throttle body and the cylinders, okay? So it's an indication of power. You can use manifold pressure to determine how much power the engine is making. Engines all the way back, it would be really low because there's a high vacuum in the manifold. But once you go up in throttle, the throttle plate opens and that manifold pressure increases because you're reducing the restriction. In the case of this engine, it's actually turbocharged, so it would go above ambient pressure, which is standard ambient pressure is 29.92, right? Now, your propeller is what you use to control RPMs. You can think of your propeller as a transmission. So if I had it all the way forward up here where it's at, think of that as first gear. And if I pull the propeller back, think of that as fifth gear. In first gear, the propeller is at its low pitch. With the propellers pulled all the way back, they go to a high pitch, or they're taking a much larger bite out of the air. So what your pilot will do is he'll set his power, so we'll call it 75% or 80% power, and he uses manifold pressure to set that. And then once the power is set, or 75 or whatever the number is percent, he'll pull his propellers back until his RPM is somewhere in the 2300, 2400 RPM range. So he knows he's got 75% power on the engines and he's got 2300 RPMs and we're just cooking along in fourth gear. Obviously you climb or you ascend and descend with the propellers in low pitch. You want to get as much power as you can for the climb, but once you're in cruise, you want to put it in fifth gear. You want to put the propeller all the way into high pitch, take a large bite out of the air, and go as fast as you can for the RPMs that you're going. Which leads me to my last control over here on the quadrant, and that is your mixture. As airplanes go up in altitude, the air thins out. The amount of fuel required for the burn in the cylinder reduces. So as airplanes, I'm going to put this forward. This is going to be really loud. I'm sorry. As airplanes go up in altitude, the fuel mixture will get more and more rich. This is bad because it'll foul the spark plugs and cause other issues. So as you go up in altitude, you actually pull the mixtures back. Now, it's not like you constantly have to do this as you're climbing. You usually set it every 5 to 10,000 feet or so, depending on your preference. And again, you'll usually set it in cruise. A lot of times for climb, you'll just use full rich, regardless of what altitude you're at, because you're trying to make sure the engine is cooled. These are air-cooled engines. Extra fuel helps cool the engine. You just leave it in there. But once you've reached that cruise altitude, you've set your power, you've pulled your RPMs back, you'll start to pull the mixture back. And when you pull the mixture back, again, you look at RPMs. When your RPMs reach the perfect number, if you will, they'll begin to increase, right? So it's running rich. It's not running as well as it could. So your RPMs are going to increase and increase and increase and increase and increase until you reach the point where everything's perfect and it starts to get lean, and then they start to fall back off again. So once they start to fall back off again, so you pull the mixture, and then it starts to fall back off, you'll push the mixture back to the rich until it falls about 50 RPMs, and is 50 RPMs, I guess you could say south, 50 RPMs below, it's stoichiometric or perfect efficiency, and that will help keep the engine cool. You're not running too rich, so you won't foul your spark plugs, and so on and so forth. Then once you return into a descending altitude, you'll put the mixtures back full rich, you'll pull the throttle back, you'll push the propellers all the way to low pitch, and you'll begin coming back down in altitude. There is one other control on here that I would like to show you, and that is your cowl flaps. It does say pull to close. I'm gonna see if I can open this window. If you see those 3 little vents there, and there, inside of each of those 3 little vents is a butterfly valve, and that controls the amount of air that's allowed to flow through the cowling to cool the engine. So obviously, with a bunch of air flowing through the cowling, the airframe is not as slippery as it could be. It's not as efficient as it could be. So you pull these shut at altitude when you're in your cruise altitude, so that your airplane is as slippery as possible and as fast as possible. But if the engines get hot, if you're in a climb, if you're on the ground, or whatever the case may be, you would push these open, opening those valves and letting air flow through the cowling to cool the engine. Now, 2 things to note. Air always flows through the cowling, even with the cowl flaps closed. Air is always going to flow through the cowling. You're just controlling how much. They call that efficiency in cooling. The more air flows through the cowling, the more drag there is on the airplane, the slower you fly. So if I can control the amount of air to the minimum amount necessary to cool the engine, my airframe will be more efficient, I will fly faster, I will burn less fuel, so on and so forth. I know I talked fast. It is, again, it's very early in the morning, just like it was in the last time I filmed this video. I've had a lot of coffee, but I hope this information was helpful. If that cleared anything up for you, awesome. Be sure to hit the like button, leave us a comment, subscribe, and as always, be easy.